So this week of the year is often referred to as Christ the King Sunday or Reign of Christ Sunday. Sometimes this is a complicated Sunday, so I decided that I'd look at the title of King. A question I like to ask is what qualities I appreciate when I look to someone called royal. In Christ's case, a king, because we often see very human royalty in history and today. Take, for example, King Henry VIII. He had 6 wives, hoping for a male heir, and now has a rhyme about him, as well as a musical about his wives. If you look up the musical 6, if you have a moment, it's very good. Like all humans, there's good too. We wouldn't have the United Methodist Church if we hadn't founded the Anglican one, but that's a lesson for another time, and is yet another example of his claim to power. Members of the royal family are often deified, as many of the monarchies claimed they were God ordained, and that is how they claimed their power and on who they excluded. The divine right of kings was both a political and a religious doctrine, which says that the person born is divinely ordained to take the crown. This often meant that if you were God ordained, you felt you no longer had to listen to earthly groups, such as Parliament, and made any mistake that you made, it was just not relevant because you were God ordained. In the minds of royalty and those in their kingdom, they were who God chose and they could do no wrong. Their location as royalty was political and social, as well as geographic. They reigned over a specific place at a specific time. They were only royalty in a certain area. Their kingdom had a clear border of an end, even if they spent their time on earth attempting to add to those borders. This is a contrast to the kind of king that Jesus gave an example of in his life on earth, whose reign continues throughout the world and beyond. It is Jesus's origin that makes him king, not his location, not the boundaries set before him like kings before and after him. Yes, Jesus was God ordained, and he challenged those around him, but he is willing to welcome those into the story. From his birth, Jesus challenged the typical boundary-setting, limiting regal status. Born in a manger, Jesus was not brought in front of the courts revealing his regal heritage, although it was traced back to David, but I diverge. But instead, he was brought in front of the shepherds who cared for the flocks. His whole life as a leader flips the title of king as we understand it. In the text we heard today, Jesus is called king in a Johannine narrative during Pilate's interrogation. King is said 9 times before Pilate, reflecting the intersection of religion and politics. Jesus does this annoying thing where he responds to Pilate's question with a question. Jesus defines kingship by what he's not in verse 36, if you have it in front of you. And in verse 37, he said what he is and what he has done. The metaphor of shepherd is often used for king. The historical text we study has shepherd after shepherd, whether that is the patriarchs or Moses or others we study. There are royals throughout, including that of Queen Esther, who foils a plan to kill her people, or that of David, who is both shepherd and king. Jesus is not the first in the text to be king, and he takes lessons he learns from earlier stories to be the best king that he can be. He takes lessons as well from Ruth and Naomi of loyalty and of being the new Adam and learning from mistakes. He learns how to serve and be served. But Jesus is king because Jesus is God. And God came down to earth, humbled God's self, and served to the point of trial and death on a cross. Jesus as king challenged the living regal class. It's easy to just say the Bible is something that happened hundreds of years ago, and it's not political, but in reality, John and this kingship narrative have theological and political significance with multiple definitions. Richard Rohr said that most of us understandably start the journey assuming God is up there, and our job is to transcend the world to find him. We spend so much time trying to get up there, we miss that God's big leap in Jesus was to come down here. So much of our worship and religious effort is in the spiritual equivalent of trying to go up what has become the down escalator. Jesus came down here, as opposed to kings who don't want to leave their castles. Jesus contrasts his officers to the temple officers. His power is not secured by force, but allows free will. He is a king by birth in a reign we may never fully understand on earth, but allows each of us to choose to have a relationship. People follow Jesus based on their choice to. It is a risk, but it is not something forced upon them. Even within the text we read today itself, Pilate is asked if he believes Jesus is king. Even at a trial for capital punishment, Jesus asks Pilate to think about his deification, to give that title. We believe in a king who humbled God's self to come to earth, to have fingernails, to be born in the least regal of ways, and shows us how to live by his leadership as a servant leader. There is story after story of Jesus challenging the status quo, whether that is washing his disciples' feet, a job they saw as something he shouldn't do, or dying on a cross in the fashion of a prisoner. Jesus' royalty is defined by his radical inclusion, in contrast to those kings who exclude. So why wouldn't he challenge how we talk about the title of king, or royalty, or leadership in general? He talks to people he's not supposed to. He welcomes those to the table who are not welcomed by others. He listens and talks through critiques and learns alongside leaders. He is both overly qualified as the Son of God and humble enough to sit down and listen with those around him. Jesus' reign is everlasting and ever open to all of us, should we choose to sit next to him. After the trial scene that we read today, the tragic thought to be end is what is next in the Johannine narrative. Jesus is dressed in a purple robe, and people come up next to him, mocking him. "Hail, King of the Jews," and striking him on the face. The crowd says that Jesus is a threat to the emperor, setting himself as king against the emperor's rule. Pilate says, "Here is your king." And the story continues. He's labeled as king above his head on the cross and throughout the tumult and fear and terror of the crucifixion. Jesus is identified as king. This horrific death by the state is not one that many royalty face. Sure, there are rebellions and revolutions, but Jesus was put to death by the reigning state and did not stop it out of love for each of us. Jesus cares for us to the point of death, a horrific death on a cross. The humiliation and terror did not win. Jesus showed how to serve to the extreme, and when he was raised, how to reign responsibly and as a servant, showing lessons from his childhood, his life, and his death. This is not permission to overextend yourself to the point of exhaustion and unhealthiness because Jesus did. Jesus also cares that we take care of ourselves because he cares about us. We can serve and we can also rest because we worship a God who did both. Do you remember when Jesus fell asleep on a boat? How awesome is it that we believe in a God that shows us exactly how to be leaders, to serve one another with gladness, to care for the least of these, to recognize the titles of this world and reclaim and redefine them with each moment, and to rest. Even kings rest. How can we follow the reign of Christ today? I say, serve God, serve your neighbor, rest, and share love with one another. Let us follow the example of our King.